Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome to our latest edition of the webinar series of 2024, brought to you in collaboration between HVS, Bird & Bird, AlixPartners, and EP. You're very welcome. I think it's fair to say that 2024 has been a year of many ups and downs, and many now have concerned eyes. They look forward to 2025. The recent budget has felt like another blow to many operators, especially those who are working with small margins. April will see the rise in NI contributions, as well as rates, which will hurt many. And the hope, of course, is that the consumer will continue to spend. Much does seem to sit with the consumer wanting to go out and face and have new experiences, which does make the whole framework feel quite fragile. Of course, the counter argument is that this is a bitter pill to swallow now for stronger growth to come, and that the overall picture will improve. So we look forward to hearing from our panel of experts, all our experts today, with their insights. However, whichever way you look at it, though, it's been a very challenging 8-year period for the industry when one considers how the industry has had to face the fallout from Brexit, to the COVID challenge, to the cost of living crisis, high inflation, new taxes, and of course how Trump too may or may not impact. And the odds are we're going to have faced a decade of unique challenges. One of my favorite quotes of the year has been, "Growth is projected to hold steady amid weakening prospects and rising threats. The world needs a shift in policy gear." There are opportunities, threats, and risks all around us. At the same time, the industry has seen a wave of new regulation come into effect, some of it with positive intent. The new tipping legislation is causing extra work, but also brings stronger transparency and trust to the approach. There will naturally be views on all sides of the argument. And again, today, we hope we can bring real insight into what our experts think and what the arguments really are. The one truth I think we all are becoming increasingly accustomed to is that we face more regular and faster rated challenges and change. And no doubt there'll be more to come, both good and bad. We therefore look forward to hearing from Kate Nichols, the Chief Executive UK Hospitality, which works closely with government on her views and thoughts. We will then hear from Rachel Farrington, Head of Tourism Affairs at Visit Britain. Tourism plays and is set to play an ever increasingly important role, so we look forward to hearing from Rachel. And then finally, we look forward to Russell Kett, Chairman of HVS London, lead an expert panel of experts in discussion on these issues. So welcome to all our speakers, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Please, at any time, feel free to ask questions via obviously the buttons at the bottom. We will endeavour to try and answer all the questions during the session, or at worst, after the session, but we will come back to you, rest assured. Finally, before we begin, let's just take a sounding on some of the perspectives and thoughts through a number of poll questions, if that's okay. So Izzy, can we just share the poll questions? Now, I do need you to ask just to scroll down so you can read all the questions as we go. Question 1, on balance with regard to the anticipated impact of on the UK hotel sector, was the recent budget more generous in the sector than you had expected? Broadly in line with what you expected? Not as damaging as you might have expected? Or so damaging that you're going out of business, selling up, or emigrating? Question 2, which of these measures will have the most adverse impact on your business? The lowering of employers' NI thresholds, the raising of employers' NI percentages, reduction in business rates relief, rise in minimum wage, no reintroduction of VAT rebate for overseas tourists, or something else? And finally, do you expect the profitability of your business in 2025 to increase by more than 10%, increase by more than 5%, stay about the same as in 2024, decrease by more than 5%, or decrease by more than 10%? I look forward to seeing the results. Just give them a minute, a few seconds for everyone to answer. Izzy, can you show us the results as they come through? I think we probably expected broadly in line what expected 77%. That's interesting. Question 2, 40% we're seeing the raising of NI percentages obviously being the most adverse effect. I think, again, I think that's probably in line with most people's thoughts. And then point 3, do you expect profitability is really quite evenly split, but stay about the same as in 2024, 29%? It seems to be a more steady or decrease by 5%. Very interesting. And in some ways, better than I expected. So I look forward. It'll be interesting to see all the views today. So can we open the session? To open the session, I have the pleasure to welcome Kate Nichols to come and talk to us. So Kate, welcome. And I'll pass over to you and good luck.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I think Chris and I were at an event yesterday, and he said the same thing about sort of 8 years worth of pain. I think I'm on the A to G of crises that the industry has navigated. Austerity, Brexit, COVID, debt, energy, food price inflation, and lack of growth. I'd like to stop at H, and I'd like to find something that we can look forward to. With that in mind, I've been asked to give you a quick overview, the first 150 days of the Labour government, and obviously that budget, what it means for the sector, where we're looking at, and the outlook for growth. Are we going to see any, I think is the key question. So I'm going to start counterintuitively with some of the positives and some of the things that might give us cause for optimism over that longer term period. And then I'll turn to the negatives, and you can't get away from that budget, and I'll talk through some of those. So that's the areas that I'm going to cover in my short presentation to you. So if we do look at the new Labour government, and the pros and cons, the big uncertainties, is it an opportunity, is it a threat? I think if we start with the pros, first thing is we're back to politics as the new boring, and that hasn't been the case since around 2016. When we had the Brexit referendum, and actually arguably you could say slightly before that, when we had coalition government, that wasn't normal. You didn't have the same sense of certainty around what was going to be coming through. So this is the new boring. It's quite clearly marked up as a 5 to 10 year project, which is why it causes the frustration that it does to business in the short term, because we're all focused on the immediacy and the immediacy of survival in many cases in the hospitality sector. But this government is looking at 5 to 10 years. We're likely to therefore see certainty and stability being brought to bear on political and macroeconomic life and debate. It allows for some long-term planning, and it allows for a sense of reassurance back to the investor community in particular, that you can start to get some traction on some of the big issues, that we can become less of a basket case that we have been seen as being before. And when you look at what is happening in the US and in the EU, we are in that midpoint. And I think Keir Starmer's speech at the Guildhall, the Lord Mayor's speech on foreign policy, positioning ourselves in between those two extremes and in between the uncertainties that you've got going on in other major economies, you can see how that is going to be a key part of brand Britain when the government is projecting itself forward. And it is clearly looking at 2 terms, and despite all the travails that it's faced in the first 100 days, the odds are that it is still a 2-term government. Secondly, that macroeconomic stability, the rule of law coming back into play, and the sort of government by technocrats. Let's not forget, Keir Starmer is essentially a civil servant. You are looking at that stability and certainty, and you have a plethora of strategies coming out of the government which will give longer term certainty. So we are back to having an annual budget, and it's going to be in the autumn, and that gives certainty and stability around key changes. Businesses don't like economic shocks. This budget was bad for a couple of those very big ones, which we can turn to. But the idea that you might have 2 or 3 times a year some fiscal event that changes fundamentally what you're doing, back to the stability of an annual budget. We will have an investment strategy, and we are seeing FDI returning as we see the UK being a bit more of a safe haven. There are some pros and cons around that. Again, if you have those shocks coming through, that can be undermined, but the government is working very hard to present its case for being stable and certain. We are seeing sovereign wealth fund, capital wealth reform changes, unlocking that global reinvestment, and you haven't had a flicker around the election or indeed the budget from that sort of broader investment community, despite all the challenges that we've seen. There will also be a trade strategy, and as part of that, you are starting the process of renegotiation around Brexit. I don't think it'll be a wholesale unpick, but you can see yesterday the Chancellor going and talking about some reforms being taken forward, and as part of that, they are looking at youth mobility, which will be key for our sector in particular, where you get youth movement, both from a tourism, travel, visitor, but also working holiday visas. And then finally, in that sort of strategy and strategizing, you have the industrial strategy, a big focus within there about people and place, a very big focus on the foundation economy, which is what we're classified as. So you've got your 8 high growth sectors, high productivity sectors that are in clusters around the UK, and then running throughout the industrial strategy, a key theme around the importance of place-based businesses in the foundation economy, the places that people live, work and invest across the UK, the ones that are not clustered but are enablers of growth, facilitators of growth in those high growth sectors, the ones that do the neighbourhood jobs and investment and high streets. And underneath that, you will see a small business strategy and a high street strategy. So again, as I say, government with a long-term economic plan, these areas that they might look at. And as part of the industrial strategy, they talk about some big issues that businesses wanted to get changed for some time: grid connectivity, infrastructure, both transport and IT, cheap energy and lowering of business energy bills in particular, and then the critical one being skills and reform in the skills area around apprenticeship levy, around business skills and vocational training and in-work training, but also sort of fit for purpose from sort of entry-level school right the way through to later on. And again, a big focus there on foundational skills, transferable skills, and a golden thread of hospitality running throughout that. And for us in particular, very pleased to have confirmed that we will have a hospitality strategy, we will have a high street strategy, and we will have a visitor economy tourism strategy. So being able to take forward some of the big issues, the crunchy issues that we know we need to get right, that we haven't been able to get traction on because of all those crises that have knocked things off track. And the final point is, you've got a mission-led government here. We can harness that if they stick to their missions. It's very difficult to know whether it's 5 missions, 6 missions, 7 foundational strands. It does keep changing, but it does mean that you've got a very central focus on delivering. So although there might be some hollow laughter around this, and there was much hollow laughter that came out around the budget, you know, the top priority of this government remains growth. The industrial strategy is one element of that plan to get growth moving, but it's not the only one. And they are returning to that gradually to be able to see what they can do to unlock growth. But for underneath that, for the Department for Business, it's regeneration of the high street, it's 80% employment, it's opportunity for all, it's social mobility, it's all the spaces that our sector can play best in, does play best in, and that the government wants to work with us to support. So there's a lot that can be done. But as I say, you've got the pain of the budget that we've got to get over and got to get over first. So that said, then turning on to the cons, I mean, there's 2 big cons really when we're looking at this. Yes, there's the budget, and I'll come on to those measures, but the doom and gloom and the overdoing the doom and gloom that started in August off the back of the riots, and then the things can only get worse mantra that the Chancellor has really kept on over the course of the summer, that has had a really damaging impact and an immediate impact on consumer confidence and consumer spend and footfall. The minute Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves stood up in August and said, we've got a £22 billion black hole, the economy is in a worse shape than we thought, it's going to be difficult, we're going to have to make some tough choices. Guess what? Consumers stopped going out, they stopped spending, both in high streets, hospitality and retail. We've seen it across the board, but we saw it immediately in the week. That weekend, we saw it across the tills, and we haven't seen it pick up since. So we've seen it bumping along, although we saw green shoots of growth, we saw positive return of consumer confidence on the back of the election. Bizarrely, a lot of consumers were waiting for that, felt that the change was happening, things were going to get better, and then to be told they weren't, big problem. And we've seen growth bumping along at sort of below 1% like for like. And when you think that cost price inflation in the sector currently still running at around 8-9%, likely to get back up to 13%, as it has been a real big challenge there, where the demand is not coming through and the spend is not coming through at the same level as you need to cover those costs. So we've had that squeeze in the middle for those businesses, and as Chris said at the start, for those that are high volume, low margin, that's particularly challenging. But you've clearly seen a suppressing of demand, and although household income has been protected, household taxes have been protected, you've got higher living wage, you've got wage settlements in the public sector, you've got cuts in NIs for employees that went through earlier in the year, and you can see positive signs from the Bank of England and on inflation. It hasn't changed the dial as far as consumers are concerned, and part of that will be because of the budget. Because inevitably, when you look at what's happened in our sector, and retail is the same, between us, we employ about 7 million people. We're the sort of second and third largest private sector employers. You factor in our supply chain, you're getting up close to sort of 9 million. You've heard squeals of pain from businesses in that sector about the impact of the budget. For hospitality, it's £3.4 billion tax increase. I was quite surprised by the results of the poll, because every single business I've spoken to says it is the tilt in the threshold in the NIs that is the big change, and was the shock in the budget that they hadn't planned for. Everybody had factored in the increase in the rate, but the change in the threshold is 4 times as impactful for the sector as a whole as the change in the rate, and that's what's caused the problems. And it's a regressive tax. It hits those on lower wages. So if you're a minimum wage employee in the sector, working part-time 20 hours, your increase in tax rate for your employer is 75%. If you're a full-time at minimum wage, it's about 37%. If you're full-time at higher level pay, it's around 7%. So that's the impact. So we're going to see 85% of our businesses say they are going to cut staff hours and jobs, 95% say they are going to increase prices, and 97% say they are cutting investment altogether in order to be able to withstand that. So we're seeing a triple whammy in the economy, and that means that all the positives that I talked about from the budget that the government thought they delivered to normal consumers who may go out and spend, means that you've got the opposite effect. And when you look at the analysis, the OBR analysis and Deutsche Bank, which is a worse assessment, you can see the pain coming through in years 1 and 2 post this budget, despite the fact that the government say they're not coming back for a second bite at the cherry. You don't get growth going in the economy until year 4 or 5 of this parliament. A long time to be bumping along the bottom, and a long time to be potentially enduring stagflation. You can see a worsening impact on inflation, as you see a greater impact on the basket of goods coming through from hospitality price increases, as well as retail. You're going to see probably 1 to 2 percentage point worsening in the inflation situation. So instead of being around the 2% mark, it's going to be closer to 3.5–4% for a couple of years longer. And the Bank of England has already said they won't cut rates as fast or as far. So you're going to see a 1/4 to 1/2 percentage point worsening in the interest rate situation. So it's not unsurprising that consumers are not feeling positive and are not going out and spending. They think that they are going to see a worsening in their situation. And I think that is going to be the big thing that we see that defines hospitality for the next 12 to 18 months. This wall of pain and cost coming through in April, but also a longer term lagging indicator of consumer confidence, where consumers don't feel that the pound that's in their pocket, the amount of money that they've got, can be spent. It needs to be saved, because the pain is still going to come. And that's going to continue when you've got more and more commentators saying that the government is going to have to come back for more bites at the cherry. So a second then is that kind of age of austerity. I think you were looking at, again, those poll ratings talking about areas that the businesses would like to have seen some money spent. We are going to see nothing spent on things like VAT rebates on duty-free sales, a VAT cut to stimulate demand. There just isn't the volume in the public finances to be able to absorb that and manage that. And again, that feel-bad factor of paying more in tax, not seeing public sector services improve, and the higher spending that is going to be continued to be demanded of this government to prove that it can make a difference when it goes through in 2 critical election years next year, local elections, but more importantly in 2026, Scottish elections and Welsh elections, there's going to be pressure to be able to demonstrate that this pain has seen a difference. And so I think rather than seeing investment in the sector, you are going to see sin taxes, and you're going to return to fuel, alcohol, those increases being baked in, and the pain coming further forward. So I don't think we are going to see any big handouts. And what you saw from Rachel Reeves is that she's very fiscally conservative with a small c chancellor. It's very balancing the books. Cash out here has to be paid for by a tax increase there. And there's nothing that's a free giveaway. So I think from a business point of view, again, you're going to see bigger pain. So the pain of tough choices then is my final point that we're looking at when we're going further forward. Regulation. Business as a force for good is likely to be that quid pro quo. It's a very transactional government. Any support that we look to get, you're more likely to see regulation coming through, or an ask on regulation. And I think you can see in some of the early stages of this government, we've managed to push back on it quite extensively. But you've got still some very interventionist, left-leaning, but also far-right leaning as well, or on the right wing leaning around nanny state interventionism and Presbyterianism, regulation of food, smoking, we saw coming straight back. Regulation of alcohol. There's a lot of demands on the government. If you don't have very much money, if you can't do many more tax increases, if you don't have many more big levers at your disposal, there is a tendency for government to reach for those big ticket items that look as though they're making a difference and interfering. So I think we are likely to see further interventions in our sector. You've got regulating departments like DHS, Department of Health, and DEFRA dusting down proposals that have been sitting on the blocks for 2 to 3 years, packaging taxes, coffee cup taxes, tourism taxes, the chief medical officer pressing on minimum alcohol unit pricing, planning restrictions around fast food, high salt, fat, sugar, food, advertising restrictions, all of these issues being talked about. Now, the big lever that we've got, of course, is that when you've imposed that level of taxes on a sector, the Treasury and the Business Department are pushing back quite strongly against over-intrusive regulation. But it does mean that you are going to see that coming back through in the agenda, and I think we just need to have a big watch out on that. And then the final point is, again, it's sort of slightly schizophrenic. The government has this big plan around foreign investment, attracting inward investment, making Britain a great place to do business, seeing hospitality as part of making Britain a great place to do business. The Prime Minister talked about it as the soft capital that unlocks hard investment. The key bit that's missing, in my view, when you look at it across the board of what the government is doing, and again, I have high hopes that they will think again around this because of what they've just done on taxes. One of the big things that makes Britain an attractive place for inward investment is its flexible labour market. And the final area of concern around over-regulation, where the jury is still out, is the make work pay agenda. If a smaller sector is the price for that, for the price for improved productivity, then many in the Labour Party and the Labour government say that is a price worth paying. And that's what we're pushing back against. But equally, there is a sort of a tension at the heart of government between the Deputy Prime Minister and the Business Department about how far you go on labour market regulation and how far does it undermine the government's objectives around growth, 80% employment, around inward investment. So still a lot of work to go, and that there's a lot of detail to be worked through. Most of that will happen in 2025 around 0 hours contracts, unfair dismissal, day one rights, all of those kind of areas. Labour market flexibility, even if we manage it, will impact upon that broader macroeconomic environment and business sentiment and ability to spend. So it's a tension that we're exploiting at the moment post the budget. We're continuing to push back against those budget measures. We're continuing to ask in advance of the competitive spending review, the comprehensive spending review in the April, for some investment into the sector around skills, jobs and recruitment, as well as innovation and going green. But that big area one then is about that labour market flexibility and maintaining our flexibility to continue to be nimble, agile, and to encourage investment. I'm going to pause there because I'm just about out of time, but hopefully that's given an overview of the areas that we're working on, Chris.
That was great, Kate. It's certainly a lot of content, so thank you for that. One quick question for you. I suppose we're talking about short-term pain, which sounds like it's going to last 2 to 3 years, for growth in 2028, which seems like a long time away. Lack of investments, quite a bleak picture out there. However, can I ask, how's the relationship between hospitality and government? One of your great successes has how you built for new levels of relationship between the industry and government. How are you seeing that now?
I think it's as strong as it has been. We've worked really hard with my team over the course of the last 12 to 18 months to build relationships with not just the Labour front bench, but also the special advisors, the policy people who are working now in government to deliver, so that they have an understanding of our sector. It doesn't always mean that they don't choose to do the things that we don't like, as we've seen, but it is positive, and I think it's really helpful as well, and it demonstrates the close relationship that the Hospitality Sector Council and the Visitor Economy Tourism Council both have been stood back up immediately. Both are working through on co-creating solutions. Both are working on strategies. You don't really have that in other sectors of the economy. So we are a little bit further ahead. And I think the government does value, the Chancellor has always talked about the everyday economy. The Business Secretary, Johnny Reynolds, talks about the foundation economy, and it's written throughout the industrial strategy. So it's there. As I say, it doesn't mean we get what we want all the time. We just have to keep pushing and campaigning. And that's where we need the whole of the industry. It can't just rest on our shoulders to have that front door. We can knock the front door down, but we need the whole of the industry to be working with their local MPs to make the case.
Great. Kate, thank you very much. That was excellent. Thank you very much for your contribution. That's really kind. I now ask Rachel. Hi, Rachel, to join us. Rachel is Head of Tourism Affairs at Visit Britain, and I'll be interested to see the kind of view that Rachel's got to portray to us.
Good morning, everyone. It's always daunting to follow Kate when I'm giving a presentation, so I'm going to have a little bit of a crutch in some slides, and hopefully these will give you some insights into the sector. So, as was just introduced, my name is Rachel Farrington, and I'm Head of Tourism Affairs at Visit Britain, Visit England. We are the National Tourist Board, and we have a statutory duty not only to promote Britain as a tourism destination, but also to support the sector, especially the English local visitor economy through the LVEP programme, and also provide timely insights and data to the sector. And that's some of the things I'm going to be drawing on today in my presentation. So I'm going to focus on some of the insights that we have. I'm choosing a very small section of the sector in the accommodation, but we have insights and data from across the visitor economy sector to share as well. And then I'm also going to be talking a little bit about what Visit Britain and Visit England is doing to drive growth, which is, as Kate said, the main mission of this government. So a lot of data on this slide, but I wanted to take a zoom out first and look at the tourism sector as a whole. As we can see, inbound and domestic visitors spend billions in the UK. It is a huge sector, and that's something that we're often trying to communicate with government to show the scale of what we can achieve as a growth sector. We're all driving towards growth at the moment, and I think we've got a really good story to tell in that we can produce that in-year growth rather than waiting kind of 10, 15 years for a return. You invest in tourism, you can get visitors here within weeks, months, spending in the UK economy. The domestic sector too has huge impact, especially on those more regional destinations that really rely on that spend that's distributed around the country. So I'm going to touch on some consumer insights. We started this particular piece of research during the pandemic, and it started off as kind of tracking consumer sentiment around COVID and whether people were looking to take domestic or international breaks. And as we've come out of the COVID pandemic, it's kind of transformed into a piece of work that now really shows us what the appetite is for domestic breaks amongst Brits. So this is Brits surveyed, and we've been tracking it month on month. So there's some good news and bad news. A lot of people still think the worst is still to come. Cost of living crisis is definitely dominating this research now. And we can see that a lot of people are still quite pessimistic about the future and think that there's still some difficult times ahead. But we can see that people are wanting to take domestic holidays. So we can see that about 65% are planning to take took a domestic trip in the last 12 months. About 35% are planning, 35% are also planning an overseas trip in the next 12 months as well. So the appetite to travel is definitely still there. The disappointing stat here is the number planning to reduce their number of domestic trips. So 26% overall saying because of the cost of living, they're going to reduce the number of trips they're taking domestically. Now, as I said, I focused on accommodation in the next couple of slides, but if you would like to access any of this sentiment data, it is publicly available on our website. So why do people choose domestic trips over international? I think this is a really interesting question. Essentially, people find it much easier to plan a domestic trip. They find it easier to book and easier to travel. They find that there's less queues, and essentially it's just an easier and more enjoyable opportunity. And that's a good sign for us. But the things drawing them the other way and going internationally is better weather. And unfortunately, as the tourist board, it's something we wish we could control, but it's always going to be a challenge for us. Other good news is that hotels dominate the kind of preferences for domestic visitors. Hotels have always been kind of the top choice for domestic visitors of where they want to stay, and that's remained steady throughout this piece of research. We can see that second down is kind of staying in a rented accommodation, like a short-term let, but the hotel industry is still that kind of favoured option for most domestic visitors. Now, this is where it really gets interesting. The cost of accommodation is seen as the biggest barrier to people taking domestic trips. And this is something that has kind of stayed pretty consistent ever since the cost of fuel has kind of started to reduce at the end of 2022. And then the cost of drinking and eating out is a solid second. So it gives a lot of kind of context to what Kate was just talking about. The cost pressures that are on businesses are also then reflected on the cost pressures that are on consumers. And we can see that those two things are in slight conflict. We know that behavior change because of those cost pressures is also coming through. So 23% saying they're going to choose cheaper accommodation. And that's the challenge for the sector, is that consumers are very price aware. They're going to be looking for those deals. And unfortunately, when you have cost pressures on businesses, those are going to be harder to find as well. And so that's what you can kind of see, the economic impact on both sides of the supply and demand side of the sector. But we're also seeing some people saying they're going to take a day trip rather than an overnight trip as well. And that will, of course, impact the accommodation sector. Moving quickly on to international visitors. So this is inbound. Just a bit of context before I go on to talking about what Visit Britain, Visit England do. We can see here that preferences for how people book international trips is different in different markets. And this is key to our strategy as an organisation in terms of driving that demand to Britain, because we have to talk to different parts of the market. So we can see here that in Asia, it's mainly through travel agents and online booking agents that you're booking an entire trip with accommodation included, where in Europe, those more kind of local markets, they're more comfortable booking individual pieces of product. So if you're an accommodation provider, if you're looking to appeal to a European market, you can stand alone and be on the kind of booking.com platforms and get those bookings directly. Where if you're trying to appeal to that Asian market, you might then look towards kind of travel providers that are putting together packages to get your product to market. And as I said, I'll kind of come back to this in talking about Visit Britain, Visit England strategy for supporting the sector. So there is an argument that people will come here anyway. Britain is an incredible destination, is really well known, and we definitely play on that. The reason Visit Britain, Visit England exists is to drive both a sense of urgency. Britain is too often seen as a bucket list destination that will be the same whenever you visit it. So we're trying to make sure that people feel that they need to come now and spend money in our economy now. So that's one reason why Visit Britain's activity is required. The other part is about driving that regionality. London naturally dominates the kind of awareness that people have of Britain internationally. So we're here to tell international visitors about the whole of Britain and try and drive them into some of those fantastic destinations that they might not have seen or heard of. We're also working to support the sector Kate has talked about kind of some of the lobbying and things that they're doing as a sector. We're also working to both represent the sector internally with government. We're part of a government department, so we do a lot of intelligence sharing. We share these kind of bits of data that I've shown with you with DCMS. We're also working on training programs, which I'll talk you through in a second, to make sure that SMEs have that support to internationalize their business, to grow their business, to become more sustainable and accessible too. So as I said, Visit England is the kind of supply side of our organisation that's really supporting the wider sector. We work with local visitor economy partnerships. So that's your kind of Marketing Manchester, Visit Kent organisations to really drive that growth on a local level. So working with them on local growth plans, all the way up to running training courses for SMEs to help them internationalise, make it really accessible for them to be able to advertise on those Chinese platforms, or getting new business from the Gulf, those kind of programs. We've had 400 businesses take part in that training last year, and it's something I think is a really good opportunity, especially for those micro businesses, which make up more than 55% of our sector. And then, of course, the big showcase piece of what Visit Britain and Visit England do is our international campaigns. So we kind of split these into 3 strands of activity, which map onto the markets, as I was talking about before. So the first thing is connecting and distributing. So this is about taking the product from Britain and showing it to those international buyers that might be from those online travel agents, or they might be from kind of travel bookers, and making sure that they get a really great range of product onto their books, so that consumers from international markets have more choice. So we can see in the picture here, this is one of our trade missions to Asia, where we took international British businesses out to meet those international suppliers on the ground, but we also do it the other way. So we bring international journalists, media buyers, travel buyers to Britain to see the product as well. The central piece is in the Inspire part of our program, and that's our international marketing campaign. So the things you'll be familiar with seeing in the train stations in Europe, and I'll give you an update on our upcoming campaign shortly. The last thing is conversion. So we know that seeing an advert in a tube station isn't necessarily going to get you to book. It's how do you make that really accessible for visitors? So we work with those household names to make sure that visitors can actually book their trip to Britain. And that's how we drive that conversion through from the inspiring, connecting them to distributors, all the way through to those actual bookings. So as I said, we have a new international marketing campaign launching next month, and unfortunately I can't share it with you yet, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a preview about what we're thinking. So the new film and TV campaign starring Great Britain will be launching next month, and it's taking advantage of all of the fantastic film and TV productions that we have here in Britain, from Wolf Hall and Bridgerton all the way through to James Bond and Paddington. We want to show that Britain is the real star of the show of these productions. So we'll be using the film and TV hooks to talk about British destinations. It's a really exciting campaign, and it's going to be part of a long-term platform that we hope to build upon. I've put in my notes that we want to create a blockbuster franchise of these kind of campaign points coming out for years to come, because I think there's so many fantastic productions even in the pipeline that we can build on. And that campaign will be going live in the US, France, Germany, the Gulf and Australia. So those are really high value, high spending markets that we want to drive that urgency from that I talked about earlier, and those bookings from across Britain. So we're making sure to incorporate destinations from every corner, every nation and region, so that we can tell a really holistic story about modern Britain and all of the exciting things there are to do here. So that's our international marketing campaign. I'll end with just a couple of pictures to bring this to life, because I've talked a lot about theory and our strategies, but this is what it looks like on the ground. So up in the top left there, you can see our former campaign, which was Spill the Tea on GB. That's in the Paris Metro, and you can kind of see there, that's the kind of places that our film and TV campaign will be showing. And then we've also got on the right there some of the trade activity that we do around the world. So having those trade missions, going to those big international trade shows and connecting business with buyers. And then at the very bottom there, you can also see where we've brought those international trade to Britain to see that product on the ground. So I'll end there, if I can stop sharing, and very happy to take any questions before we move on to the panel.
Rachel, thank you. That's very, very good. Firstly, good luck with the campaign. It's obviously going to be a big thing for next year. What are your aspirations as we go into next year?
So as Kate mentioned, we've got a spending review, and of course the spending review determines the funding of government departments and importantly us as an arm's length body of a government department. So we are going to be trying to show all of this activity that we do in the background, try and show that to politicians, to decision makers, to the Treasury, to show how we are a sector that does drive growth and can deliver on those government missions. So that's my big ambition for next year.
Good luck on that. Sounds like I've got two big things. But I'm assuming I think general growth inward is about 6 billion up since 2019 from your slide.
Yes, so we're starting to see that
message overall, isn't it?
Yes, but of course we've had inflation. So that's distorted it ever so slightly as well.
Yeah, I know. Still going in the right direction, which is the point, isn't it? Yeah. Rachel, look, thank you very much indeed. That was excellent. And I wish you well for next year. Sounds like you've got a big year coming up. And now I have the pleasure to invite Russell to come and join me.
Good morning.
Morning. Well, good luck with the panel.
I noticed there was one question from one of our audience asking, why was Rachel focusing on England and not Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland? Just to answer that, Rachel, I don't know whether you're still there, but I believe that the answer is because that's your brief.
Yes.
Visit Britain and England specifically, and someone else takes care of the rest of the British Isles.
Yes, so just to explain very quickly, so tourism is a devolved competency. So Visit Wales and Visit Scotland are managed by the respective Scottish and Welsh governments, but we market Britain as a whole internationally, and then domestically we focus on England.
Wonderful.
Great, thank you. Great.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Kate. And please, can I invite my distinguished panelists to put themselves on screen, turn on their microphones and cameras. Peter, Puneet, Ed, James, Graham, and Emma, we're all here. They're going to ensure that all our questions get answered, both the ones that I've prepared and, of course, distinguished audience members, yours. So please use the Q&A button to write in any questions that you may have during the course of our session. And as Chris said at the beginning, if we aren't able to answer it live during the session, we'll get back to you with a written answer. Okay, we have about 45 minutes and little more. So let's get on with it. I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves in 2 sentences. Okay, count them as they go along. First sentence is your name, your company, and your role within your company. And then secondly, in the second sentence, your biggest concern, only one, for the UK hospitality sector emanating from recent governmental initiatives. So just one, very quickly. And I'm going to look at my screen as I do this. I'm going to start with Ed, because you're at the top of my screen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ed Odell, one of the directors at Flint Global, which is a business advisory helping companies with regulatory and policy challenges. So we're sort of made up largely of sort of ex-civil servants, ex-politicians, and so on. My own background is as a reformed Treasury official, and so I sort of come here today from the perspective of the sort of economic policy, and specifically in my case, sort of tax policy issues. And I suppose that would be my sort of main concern here, which is actually for the sector that in the tax policy and perhaps maybe more broadly in the sort of industrial strategy space, the government hasn't got a sort of coherent view, and nor does it sort of approach a lot of its policy thinking, I think, as we've seen at the budget, in this holistic way across the piece. So my concern is death by 1,000 cuts, so to speak, particularly in the sort of tax space, without anyone really having stacked up what individual measures mean for the hospitality sector.
Thanks, Ed. Can I remind everybody that there are 2 sentences available? And I think, Ed,
I used a lot of colons.
You set the wrong example. So, James, you're next.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm James Sawford. I'm a partner in the Bird and Bird Hotels team. I guess the big concern is obviously we're imposing a lot of cost on business. Are we actually going to see the growth that the government's saying they are trying to achieve?
Thank you. Emma.
Emma Young, I'm head of syndication finance at AIB. I think one of my concerns is linked a little bit to growth and the impact of the tax, the impact of all these costs. How does that leave the investor in the UK?
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Graham?
Yeah, so Graham Smith from AlixPartners. So I specialise in providing corporate finance and restructuring advice in the travel, hospitality and leisure industry. I think my biggest concerns and what my clients talk to me about is mostly that increase in the cost of employing people, and in particular the cost of employing part-time and relatively low-paid people, which is obviously a large part of the hospitality employment base.
Thank you so much. Peter Anscombe.
Hello, Peter Anscombe, Edwardian Hotels London. I'm the Senior Corporate Director there. I think really in terms of for the businesses to avoid hurt, the thing that we ultimately rely on is the elasticity of demand in terms of the ability of the consumer to continue to pick up the cost increases. The question is how long one can rely on that and what the ultimate impact will be on the businesses.
Thank you. And last but now by no means least, Puneet.
Hi, I'm Puneet Kanuga, CIO at EQ Hotels. So I think it is what all the other panelists have said. I think tax policy is front and center. I think part of that's what's passed now with the national insurance changes. And then the other big concern is what's happening with business rates and where that's going to go in the next couple of years.
Okay, so that's by way of introduction. Let's get into the meat. We'll start big, macro, and then start to sort of drill down into some of the issues. But guys and gal, what is your summary view? Okay, so listening to Kate and knowing what you do, I'd just like you to put into your words the economic and fiscal picture post-budget, how Labour is approaching its strategy from both an economic and political perspective. Now, we don't normally put experts like you into such a role to answer questions like that, but I'd just like you to give us and your audience today what you feel that the impact is going to be on the hospitality sector. And because I'm a male chauvinist pig, I'm going to go for Emma first.
Thank you, Russell. Look, I think there's been a reasonable degree of negativity around this budget, particularly from those that I've spoken to in the business community. You know, the national insurance combined with minimum wage disproportionately does impact a labour-intensive sector such as hospitality. But that said, you know, from a lender's perspective, we've seen this industry, you know, take on some significant headwinds and challenges, as has been mentioned by other speakers today over the past 8 years. So, you know, I'm reasonably optimistic, and I don't think it would be unreasonable to assume that some of that cost, yes, it will be painful up front, but there's operators out there that we believe will successfully be able to pass some of that on. But what I've actually seen, and the real talking point since the budget, in those owners and borrowers that I've spoken to, is around the inheritance tax changes. So many large UK hotel companies, family-owned, generational, employing, you know, thousands of people, face this significant increase. And only last week, I was speaking to an owner who indicated they have effectively paused all investment activity in the UK. They won't be making any acquisitions until they really understand the impact of the tax increase there. And effectively, what came out of that conversation is their options appear to be quite limited. pushing companies offshore has other impacts on the economy. So I would have to say, my view is there's a bit of a dampened business sentiment out there. It's too early to say how that will obviously translate. In summary, I think the budget net negative for the hospitality sector.
Ed, what's your view?
Well, maybe I'll give sort of the political macro view, which is my view is that Labour's only route to winning the next election, actually they've hemmed themselves in pretty quickly. Their only real route to it is above trend economic growth and above trend tax receipts that stem from that. And I think we're going to see a greater focus over the next year or so on Labour's core economic mission. They've been very focused on sort of the fiscal situation, but actually they need that. And really the question, I think, for the sector is, how do you make a case to government about your critical role in helping to deliver that growth when clearly their sort of predisposition is to look at other so-called growth driving sectors, that have typically been sort of higher productivity in the past? What is the pitch there? Because I think unless the hospitality sector can place itself at the center of that economic debate, then you're largely lumped in as almost social policy. This is about, ensuring the high streets are vibrant, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that really is sort of key question. I've got to say, I don't have an answer for that, but that feels to me like sort of playing into the government's sort of real political priorities is the way to go.
Okay, thank you. James?
Obviously, a number of people have touched on the panel in terms of the impact of the tax. I think there's a couple of things it's also worth sort of expanding on. Obviously, the first one is one of the outcomes of the budget was to see a real rise in swap rates, which obviously filters through both to hotel owners who are funding the hotels, they'll be paying more interest, but it also filters through to consumers. So I think it has an impact in terms of the wider macroeconomic, in terms of the cash people have in their pocket. I think the other thing from a sector point of view that's worth thinking about is, yes, obviously we've talked about the negative on the sector. One of the things is that it is not a flat line application across the sectors. Some types of hotels will be far more severely impacted than others. So, and I'm talking not just about the budget, I'm talking about the government's policy on things like environmental and energy costs. If you look at big country house hotels with golf courses, they employ a lot of people. They tend to be environmentally, not sort of well built from the point of view of conserving heat. They're going to have far higher energy bills and labour costs than some other sectors. And interesting, those sort of spa golf course type hotels typically have the lowest profitability of all the hotels in the sector. So you compare, for example, typically they're running profitably about 24% compared to, say, 40% for extended sector. So I think if you look at the macroeconomic point, obviously it's going to impact the hotel sector, but I think also we should perhaps talk about on the panel, isn't just going to impact the sector, it will impact some bits of our sector far more than others.
Thank you. Puneet?
Yeah, I think the impact, so it kind of putting some numbers to this now. So if you look at kind of hotels in the UK, we think the impact of the national insurance on its own will be about 3 to 4% of total payroll. If you then layer on the kind of national living wage change as well, you're looking at a 10% pop in payroll or thereabouts over the course of next year. We think even with some efficiencies baked in, you'll probably need to increase your top line by 5 to 7% to mitigate for that. And if you kind of look at where, inflation has tapered down now. So if you look at where the economy is, maybe in London, maybe in Edinburgh, you can get that kind of growth. You'll struggle to get that in many regional markets. So I think, to what other people are saying, it's not going to impact everyone in the same way. There'll be a disproportionate impact, I think, on smaller hotels, I think on regional hotels. And I just don't see that kind of, high single-digit growth coming through many of the regional markets this year.
Peter, what's your view?
I think in the same way a number of people have said, ultimately there'll be a question of how much, and as I was saying earlier, how much cost can actually be passed on. Clearly, both hospitality businesses, but also much of our client base, through whether we're looking at the operational costs or whether we're looking at the cost of living positions, they're going to feel the pain in the bottom line or in their pockets for the short to medium term. How long that will prove to be is going to be a question of whether, in terms of real growth strategy, or whether we're more in a position of sort of act and hope. I think it's hard to have confidence at the moment that there is a real thought out strategy. I'm not a political analyst, probably more of a political skeptic, but I know recently a guy who's a professor, political economist, newspaper columnist, previously was a supporter of the left, wrote that this government is very obviously failing and Rachel Reeves is a very big threat to the well-being of this country. At the moment, I don't think I have any reason to disagree with him.
And last but not least, Graham.
So I think some of the challenges certainly our clients are talking about is in some ways we're going to know the bad news that's come out from this latest budget in terms of these will be the increases in tax, reduction in the relief on things like on rates. What we don't yet know is how the consumer might respond when we're seeing increases in the national minimum wage and some of the knock-on impacts that will have in people, above that level, but who want to maintain their differential in pay. So ends up with, more money in people's pockets. So how will the consumer react to that? And, will that enable some of these price increases to be absorbed? Because, I think I would agree, absent those increases in people's pay, it feels as though across lots of aspects of the hospitality and also retail and consumer sector, that the price rise trend has sort of gone as far as it can before you start impacting demand and volumes. But we will have people's pay packets increasing in the immediate month after this being implemented. So we sort of know the downside. What we don't know yet is what might be the positive consumer impact of this.
And that's what I always love, a glass half full. Thank you. Just before I move on to my next question, one of our distinguished audience has raised her hand. I assume that that's because you wish to ask a question, but I'm going to ask you to write it into the Q&A button, if you wouldn't mind, please, so that we can deal with it properly. Despite Graham's sort of slight note of optimism around the corner, cost increases are nevertheless still being mooted, and one of which is a tourist tax, which people are continuing to talk about. Would this be a good or a bad initiative for the UK? Places like Edinburgh have been mooted already. Peter, you were talking about cost increases, and you have no hotels in Edinburgh, to the best of my knowledge.
No.
Certainly London would be quite an impact.
I mean, I think that's right. Any new tax on top of the necessary increases in ADR that are going to be necessary to fund the operational cost increases of the businesses, etc., is bound to have some impact on demand. I think if one can have confidence that the funds can be demonstrated as going towards definitive business to the sector, whether that's in the forms of the various marketing bodies, training, subsidies, whatever, if it actually delivers real benefit back in, then perhaps one could rethink the position. But personally, I'm not convinced that you would trust this government, or indeed any government, to deliver on the fact that the full benefit can come back. I think, like most things, the tax will go into a wider pot that will fund the things that they put down as their priorities, and the benefit back into the sector, I would guess, could be quite minimal, and therefore, on balance, yes, it would be a big negative.
Anybody got a different view? Puneet?
I do not have a different view.
Okay, all in violent agreement. Anybody want to challenge the very erudite way that Peter's answered that question?
Russell, not to challenge it, but obviously the tourist numbers in the UK have been down since 2019. So I think 2019 we had 40.9 million visitors to the UK. This year we're projected at 38.7. So we haven't really recovered. And there's been a report come out recently that suggests we've fallen behind. other European countries. One of the reasons for that, and there are various reasons for it, including the difficulty of getting in, is just how uncompetitive we are on cost. So I think the World Economic Forum ranks us 113th out of 119 in terms of price competitiveness for tourism. So the UK as an expensive place to come on holiday, putting yet more cost into that is not going to help that equation.
I think there's a good example of what happened in Amsterdam this year, where they actually took the tourist tax from 7% to 12.5%. And that led to Amsterdam actually going backwards in terms of ADR this year, compared to London, Edinburgh, Paris, which kind of went upwards. So in the end, if they put taxes, it's just going to have to be absorbed by hoteliers, because to what everyone is saying here, the elasticity of demand will just been stretched so much. I just don't know how much more you can stretch that at this stage.
Graham, you were wanting to come in earlier.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily a different view, but given everything that, Kate said earlier, it seems like a very natural place for the government to look in terms of just the positioning of how this tax may be viewed. Then, when you have an attractive country to visit from overseas tourists, something that can be presented as, not on the face of it being borne by, sort of the residents of the country. I think politically that can play quite well. I think also, the Amsterdam example, is one side of it, but I'm sure there are lots of other research which says it's mixed at best as to, what is the impact on actual visitor numbers. So I think, whether, people agree with it or disagree with it, it does feel like one of those things which is, in the more likely bucket than less likely, given the current environment.
Okay, Emma or Ed, anything to add?
I've got, my perspective is that, as a sort of ex-Treasury official, is that the sort of government approach to policy in this area doesn't really fit. A lot of the sort of way that things are thought about is in terms of like domestic policy and displacement, and actually if you incentivize this bit, you're just moving this bit from there to there. On the sort of VAT, sort of tax-free shopping space, actually the point here is almost, there is a section of tourists that you can either have or not have, and they can visit your country or not. And there is a set of price sensitive, they will go to Paris, they want to do shopping, they will buy a lot, it's a big attraction for them. And I don't know that sort of economic case has ever been really fully worked through with government. And the sort of final point there is to say the government's approach to costing things is very static. It says, well, look, if we did this, it will cost $1 billion, I think was the estimate. But they never really ran through. But what does it mean in terms of tax take in other parts, in terms of hotel VAT, for example, or restaurants, et cetera, because no tourist comes and just buys things and leaves. So I don't know that argument has ever been fully run through. I think there might be a little bit of political space to say, the Tories got this wrong, and there's an economic argument here that you're missing. But at the moment, the government, I would say, is so focused on sort of hair shirt. I don't know now necessarily is the right moment, but hopefully, as we get into the spending review and the period afterwards and the economic growth sort of focus returns, there may well be a moment where trying to make that case is actually sort of a realistic prospect.
Okay. Just before we move on, one of our audiences has commented basically everywhere else in Europe is doing it, and it's only a matter of when, not if. So, and on that bright note, I shall move on to another question. I know we're going to focus on staff quite a lot in this conversation because that's where most of our audience, when they answered the poll, most of you, I'm sure, feel that the majority of impact is going to be following changes to the national minimum wage, to employer NIC rates and thresholds and so forth. So do you really think that hoteliers are going to be taking the sort of horrible actions that we would prefer that they shouldn't? Are people going to reduce the number of people that they employ? Can they afford to do that and maintain standards? Are they going to just stop hiring people? Are they going to try and increase price? What do you think they're going to do, Graham?
I mean, I think that it's whenever you have a situation that increases the cost of something in the way that the budget has changed, the cost of employing relatively low paid flexible workers, it undoubtedly causes business owners and managers to revisit their assumptions on how they use that particular part of their business. So I think the point that James made around this impacting different parts of the hotel industry in different ways is undoubtedly true. There's already been a big push towards more of that limited service offer as part of the hotel market. I think even before this, the UK was moving towards more of a higher cost of labour environment, which was causing hotel business models to shift to align with that. Even if you go beyond limited service, then using technology to push more of the actions onto the guest and away from hotel staff. I think those price inflation, certainly in the luxury market, that requires a certain level of staffing to meet the demands of your guest, I think seems highly likely. I think it certainly makes things tougher in that full service mid-market space, where I think that the consumer's ability to absorb higher rates is probably more challenging than in the luxury end. And also, I think one of the things that we may see from this is as the flexibility of hiring workers and some of the other regulation that's coming in relation to that. What it might cause is hoteliers to be a little bit more cautious around taking on temporary workers to deal with those surge demand periods. And that could cause a clipping of revenues. You're not able to take the biggest advantage of those surge revenue periods, but also potentially an increase in customer complaints when hoteliers don't have enough staff on because they've been more cautious, and could have impacts on those net promoter scores that people watch very closely and online reviews. So I think there's a lot to unpack here for operators, and I think everybody is revisiting their models to see what they can do.
Sure. So just focusing on a little bit of what Graham was saying, James, has the reduction in the number of European Union workers post-Brexit led to a significant staffing gap in our sector?
I think the whole sector is what we discuss all the time, that it's finding the right people. I mean, it's all we'll talk about. Our employers are going to employ fewer staff. Most hotel owners I talk to are struggling to find enough people to employ anyway. And Peter may have a view on this because obviously you're involved in it day to day. But I think that is a reality. Yes, we may get staff numbers reduced ultimately, but I think there is still that shortage, notwithstanding the job numbers coming down recently. So I think that is a challenge. I agree with Graham's point. I think we will see technology. People will now, in many ways, these sort of making it more difficult, more expensive to employ people. I think people will start to look at technology. We've talked about it for a long time. We haven't seen it come through. Will we see AI dealing with your concierge service, your front of house? I was served my meal in the Berlin Hotel Conference last night at the reception of my hotel by a little robot that brought it to me. I think people have to start looking at these innovations and go, well, is that the way to go forward in terms of driving down employee costs if they are going to go up?
Emma, are you finding with the people that you're talking to that are interested in presumably borrowing money from you, is the attractiveness of the UK hospitality industry from an investment perspective, is that being adversely affected, or to what extent are you finding that people are sort of looking beyond the measures that have been announced?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned, some of the borrowers and owners that I've been speaking to, that wasn't actually their principal concern. They were concerned about other parts of the budget, but clearly it is a concern and it is a cost that needs to be baked in. And I think when it comes to, the areas of the market that we're interested in funding and where we've got experience and where we've had good experience, it comes down to location, location, location. And, who is managing these hotels, and to a degree the lender will look to that management team to understand their strategies for dealing with this cost increase, whether it be, as I've mentioned, top line, or in other ways. And to James's point, how much of this can be taken away through technology. We need to talk to the people who know what they're doing, and that's the management at the end of the day. It hasn't deterred us as a lender in the market. In fact, we've made a very stated play, both in the UK and the Republic, that we want to deploy our balance sheet to this sector, but it will be in segments of the sector that we're comfortable in, and management teams that get us comfortable that these costs aren't going to adversely affect their profit margins to a point that it would impact on the debt stack. This kind of goes back to how we're structuring these loans. And post-COVID, there is most definitely more flexibility in terms of lender and borrower and how those conversations are going. So I think everything boils down to, getting a really good understanding of the business model, the segment, the management, and then making sure that the appropriate debt profile is put in place.
Interesting. Peter, I think it was James was giving you a shout out in terms of being witness to the costs of employment rising because of the sheer numbers that you're employing in London alone. Was there any particular aspect of what he was saying that you felt resonated particularly in your business?
It probably cuts across a number of the parts of the conversation we either have had or will have. I mean, clearly, I should think on average, where the changes in the budget put between 1 and 1.5 million cost onto each one of the operational properties, the larger ones in London. From that point of view, that is either, I mean, you've got a limited number of choices. You're either talking about something in terms of recovery through increased ADR, you're looking at the possibility of reduced workforce, or you're looking to find other efficiencies in the business, or you're resigning yourself to less profit. And there aren't really many other possibilities. From our point of view, as full service properties, as luxury properties in London, there is a base level that you have to achieve in terms of the services that you're providing. I think going back, the comment was made relative to new technologies or whatever. Yes, in certain parts of the business that exists. Technologies in terms of the actual things like housekeeping or F&B delivery, in terms of which is really one of the more experience-based things within the hotel. Anything that's more IT delivered is detrimental to the concept of service within a luxury property. So I think it's hard to see that. Yes, the difference in terms of employment from European countries or whatever, the possibility of greater movement of younger people, you end up in this balance between what you actually need from a staffing point of view and the balance on taking people in for relatively short periods in terms of the cost of training them and giving them the experience in something that's a very transitional market anyway, and you've got a certain amount of sort of throughput. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Puneet, I was intrigued that you were saying already by how much your costs are going to be rising and not necessarily all able to be recovered through rate increases and so forth. How might hotel values be affected as a result of all this?
So I think picking
I
up.
think you know something about hotel values from your previous life.
So do you. So I think just picking up on what Peter just said. So if you have a £1 million impact on profitability in a central London hotel, that's roughly 18 to 20 million of value taken off in one go, and that's just simple maths. And you know, obviously in a market like London where you have more levers to pull and you might find that demand is a bit more elastic, you might be able to push that across to the guests and then recover in that way. But I think with all of these changes, whether it's NI, whether it's business rates or whatever's happening in terms of kind of the labor market, all of these are incremental. And then to I think Ed summarized it really well at the beginning when he said it can't be a death by 1,000 cuts. It's all kind of accretive and incremental. And if it just kind of keeps sneaking up on us, that, you know, values will be impacted. You know, for our part, what we're doing at our hotels is mainly kind of that sort of making businesses more efficient at the moment. We're having to lean in and do things like, you know, offer guests drinks vouchers to skip housekeeping, for example, or look at the hours we open on the bank holiday in certain restaurants and F&B outlets because you're paying twice as much in terms of payroll on those days. So I think you're having to be very clever. Our sector is naturally quite creative, and we've demonstrated that. But it has been quite a lot of regulatory pressure piling up on us, which will have a valuation impact over time.
Okay.
Just on that, Russell, just a sort of counter sort of our, you know, challenge, let's say, we've seen a significant amount of investment, a lot of portfolio deals and that kind of stuff being done more recently. And we keep hearing that there is a lot more capital to invest, taking aside the inheritance tax issue that might affect a cohort. Isn't there still that sort of general sentiment that people want to buy assets in the UK, and maybe to your point, you know, they particularly like London or Edinburgh, but there seems to be still a lot of inbound investment from certain, let's say, private equity or private office.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in the UK, and look, in a way, kind of what we are not talking about here is what's happening elsewhere in Europe, and are we just at least, you know, compared to some other markets, we still not as heavily regulated. Our kind of labor market is still flexible. So I think, you know, there will be interest in the UK. The question is, you know, what the pricing will be, where valuations are going to sit. Private equity is smart capital. They're looking at deploying on a global basis. So I think, and they can move very quickly. So I think at the moment, because of everything that's happening in the US, because of, you know, Europe just being a more heavily regulated market, there is a lot of interest in the UK. I think what we saw this year was maybe more of a culmination of deals that were in the making for a couple of years, as opposed to everything being engineered this year. But kind of, you know, we're operating partners. We work a lot with private equity, and the UK is definitely kind of up there in terms of desirability. But we are also seeing a lot of investors now looking at the south of Europe, for example, because those economies are growing very well, and they are now perceived to be more kind of business-friendly jurisdictions.
Thanks. Ed, I want to conclude this little section of questioning with you just to use the breadth of your experience and taking into account what Kate was saying at the beginning of our session, where she didn't feel that the government really had the intention of adding insult to injury. But what pressure do you think that the hospitality sector in general could or should bring to bear on the government, perhaps to dissuade them from thinking about making even further increases to employers' NI and so forth, because this has already been mooted in spite of what Kate was saying?
Yeah, I mean, my observation is that it was very starkly obvious in the materials that produced alongside the budget that they had not thought about the national living wage change and the employer NICs change together in a combined effect. And in fact, if you do so, I think it probably leads you down a different policy route. So I think the challenge for the industry now is, to some extent, maybe to like plug that evidence gap, which I think we've had some conversation about, you know, what is the real world impact here, and what's realistic in terms of sort of future asks of government, which is to think very carefully around the sort of future national living wage changes, and sort of coming back and sort of looking at these sort of broad I guess, property intensive, high employment sectors, low margins are not the obvious candidate to come to every time you need sort of a new source of income. So to think carefully in future. And then the live area of policy debate really is in the business rate space, where the government is looking at some fairly fundamental reforms. But what it's put on the table is not a one-way bet for the so-called, high street businesses that they are trying to target. In fact, like for a lot of businesses, it's giving with one hand and taking with the other. And I think there's a reasonable conversation and a little bit of political space at the moment to say to government, look, like you hit us too hard in a slightly ill thought out way. And this business rates process, we need to get to the end of this with a material improvement in the position here. And that does mean sort of redistributing away from hospitality, retail, and so on, not least with the sort of current reliefs and so on falling away. That for me feels like a realistic policy discussion. But yes, I do genuinely think that there was just no real thought given to what the package as a whole meant for sectors like hospitality at budget.
Okay. I'm going to move on to a different topic, if you don't mind. Let's talk about Airbnb just briefly, because I suspect that becomes an issue that is certainly at the forefront of a number of our panel, where they're operating hotels in competition with Airbnb. So in other countries, we've seen a clampdown on Airbnb and short stay rentals. And that might prove to be a positive move for hotel room rates, but potentially it might deter visitors overall, which of course might be the plan. So what advice do you have, panel, for the UK government in dealing with Airbnb and the like? Puneet.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I as a family, we use Airbnb quite a bit. We think it's incredibly convenient, especially when you have kids and so on. That said, I do think there needs to be a level playing field. So I think if hoteliers are facing regulations, if they are facing licensing needs, FLS audits and health and safety and so on, I do think that needs to be also applied to Airbnb and other kind of short lets. And then I think there's a wider question, maybe away from our kind of core competence, about what Airbnb is doing to residential markets in key cities in the UK. I think there's a housing shortage. There's kind of no discussion about it. So there needs to be some kind of discussion about capping how many room nights properties can be used for Airbnb, and also some consideration to planning considerations, but also to what it means for people living in those buildings.
Okay. Emma, you have a view? Are you a consumer?
I am a consumer, probably less so than maybe a few years ago. You have a couple of bad experiences and you get a little bit scarred. But I think the biggest, factor for me with my lending hat on is around that regulatory piece and, that fire, light and safety and all that kind of stuff, and reputational risk that goes with it. So from a sort of a lending side of things, it's just a little bit of an unknown, and something that we would really only factor in when looking at competitor sets, not something we would be funding.
Interesting. Peter?
Certainly agree with the point relative to the control side relative to the safety and general overseeing of the nature of properties, etc. Yes, it's happened in all sorts of other countries. Personally, I think there's a balance. I can understand more the idea of limiting the number for a property to be licensed to be able to put out on short-term rental. I don't think I disagree. I've seen it in enough other places where they limit the ability to take on numbers of rentals. At the point where you allow something to be short-term rented, but then make it so that the number of rentals that you can take in don't make it economically possible to do. And in most countries, they've also put a situation where on sale, you can't pass on that license, that you actually end up destroying part of the underlying real estate market as well. I know that's not what we're talking about here, but I think the thing is that on so many things, the government thinkings don't necessarily look at the consequential elements rather than what they perceive as the initial face value.
Okay,
there's a challenge here as well. A lot of the government legislation has been brought in UK, but across Europe has been a very blunt instrument. And what it has done is it's restricted the professional service department operators who are offering a genuine professional service for people who want it. Obviously, it's trying to tackle the housing shortage, which we talked about, and the antisocial behaviour. But it has been very blunt, and I think going forward, if there's any bit of advice to the government, it's got to be that those apart hotel service department operators who are really starting to come to the fore. We're seeing real growth in that sector, and obviously it's a very profitable sector. They need to make sure that in bringing in the legislation, it does not obstruct that, because at the moment that is exactly what's happening. A lot of those operators are simply saying we simply can't go into that jurisdiction because the restriction doesn't let for more than 90 days. It just doesn't work, which is the case in London. There are very similar restrictions elsewhere. So a lot of jurisdictions are simply, the service apartment operators are simply not going in there because they can't make it work. So that probably is the biggest challenge, particularly for that sector from our sector's impact point of view.
Okay, Graham?
Yeah, I think you can definitely see the attraction from a governmental perspective on trying to clamp down or reduce the number of properties that are used for this short-term rental market, given that they are trying to address a housing supply issue and all of the challenges that come from trying to increase that supply through building new homes. It takes an awful long time. So you can certainly see the attraction to them of trying to release more supply through shifting use. I think the comment James makes around the blunt instrument, I think it's very hard for a government to keep pace with something which has been a huge technological innovation in the rise of Airbnb that probably started with quite a neat idea of how to raise a little bit of extra income from your spare room, and has ballooned into a massive supplier of accommodation across the globe. So there's an element of catch up being played here. I think the overall mood music though can only be positive for hoteliers, because it seems as though this would be a high point in the supply of this type of accommodation, certainly in the major cities, which can be beneficial from the rates for hoteliers who are been there for a long established times, have all the regulations, etc. So yes, I can imagine possibly some lobbying around the overall societal benefits of reducing Airbnb may be happening from the hoteliers of the world.
Okay, thanks. And then finally on this topic, Ed, could we encourage there to be tighter regulations on alternative accommodation providers to level the playing field, perhaps?
Russell, that was exactly the point I was going to make, which is from the sort of, I don't know, sort of the best way to describe it, the professional or the formal hospitality sector perspective, I would just be wanting to make sure that on the regulatory and on the tax space, actually, that there is that level playing field, and that, if you are a local hotel, you are competing with the local Airbnb market, sort of at least in a fair and sort of level way, which I don't think has necessarily been the case to date. And my sort of concern would be not inadvertently sort of eroding out that sort of the hotel and local hospitality sector by not having taken a considered view of what a level playing field should really look like in that sector.
Okay. Sadly, we're running out of time. I'm just going to make an observation that one of our audience has made, that in her part of the world, in Brighton, there are 4,000 listings, which makes it impossible for hospitality staff to find a home near where they work, which is essential for shift workers. So we should all bear that in mind. I had alerted the panel to a final question, but actually I'm going to change my mind and bring in the question that unfortunately an anonymous attendee has raised, and I want a simple yes or no or can't think answer. So all being said, last question. Do you expect the ADR, RevPAR and values to rise in the next couple of years, or are we looking at a period of stagnation until cost increases are baked in and the dust settles? Ladies first again. Emma.
I think it depends on the segment of the market. I think initially probably no, but over time, yes.
Ed?
Ditto.
Oh gosh, everybody in violent agreement. James?
I mean, I guess we look at ADR rises, but you've got to take into account inflation. We had a very strong 23. I think we may really struggle to see room rates keeping up certainly going ahead of inflation. So yes, but only really to keep pace with inflation.
Okay, yes, but Graham?
Yeah, I think we'll see an increase now in transactions, and I think people will be pleasantly surprised at the values on those transactions.
Good. Peter?
I mean, there's already pressure on ADR, so I think I agree that ADR will be relatively flat in real terms. In terms of the valuation side, it comes back to your earlier valuation question. I mean, we went through a period of interest rates over 5%, and valuers found reasons to use cap rates that were below the prevailing rates and didn't really reduce the values that much. The question now will be in terms of how much of the current cost increases can be offset and how much will actually go into the valuation calculation.
And finally, Puneet, and sorry, just one sentence.
Agree with Peter and Emma.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to hand over to Karen. I want to thank the panel for the way that they've approached this. And Karen, I'm sorry I've left you zero time to close the session, but thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Russell. Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Freeb. I'm head of Bird & Bird's International Hotels, Hospitality and Leisure team. Well, we've just had some fascinating insights from our experts into the impact of the budget on our sector as we move into 2025. We're certainly facing some challenges. Our panelists and speakers covered a large range of topics, but all of them were querying, where does growth come from in the light of the fact that government is imposing more and more costs on businesses? Ed considered whether there would be a redistribution of investment away from the hospitality sector in favour of other sectors. Emma emphasised the importance at this time to investors of a strong management team to give banks the confidence in their financial competence. Staffing is forever an issue. There's still a shortage of people despite job numbers coming down. This led James Salford to question whether we were actually going to see the long-awaited tech revolution predicted for the hospitality sector come to fruition. One of Ed's key points was, with no real coherent government policy, are we in the hospitality sector facing death by 1,000 cuts? And he felt that the sector wouldn't really be able to see which way it was going and to get greater clarity on the government's plans for growth until, as he put it, the government shrugged off its hair shirt. So thank you to our wonderful panelists and speakers. Thank you for joining our 21st webinar, and we look forward to you joining us in 2025. Our webinars for next year are already in the planning stage. And meanwhile, on behalf of Bird & Bird, HVS, EP Business in Hospitality and AlixPartners, I wish you all the compliments of the season and a very happy and prosperous 2025.